If you're revisiting a classic, you've got the name value and nostalgia that means an easier sell to fans. However, expectation can be high. Taking an original product and tilting it in a new direction is a risk sometimes worth taking. The games on this list were all remakes, reimaginings, or reboots that were built from the ground up and tried lots of new things. Some succeeded, some failed, and for some the debate still rages. After all, not all risks are quite as calculated as they should be. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video game remakes that changed everything. Number 10. Final Fantasy VII Remake. No matter what Square Enix were going to do with the Final Fantasy VII Remake, it was cause for apprehension. Despite being a stone-cold classic, any revisit to the game was going to need a lot of updating to bring it to modern standards. The combat, first and foremost, shifts dramatically from 1997's random encounters to a more active and immersive system. Instead of being completely turn-based, players can attack enemies at will, and now the ATB system is more geared towards building up special abilities and magic. But the loudest concerns are about the fragility of the story. Over the years, FF7's world has been grown by spin-offs. While some thought the original needed to be revisited in order to better tie these in, other fans thought that the game was better as a standalone experience and worried that the remake would render the original obsolete. However, in a stroke of mad genius, major story departures in FF7 Remake are part of the story. Every time the plot deviates from the original, Cloud is attacked by strange wraiths. This waylays any concerns about the delicacy of the plot and replaces it with intrigue, since FF7 Remake is designed specifically to tell players it's going off script. Instead of attempting to overwrite the original, this game actually takes place alongside it, and the word remake in the title cleverly actually means something else entirely. Number 9. Medieval Resurrection. He's no Crash Bandicoot or Spyro the Dragon, but Sir Daniel Fortescue had a chance of being the goth of the video game mascot family. His Tim Burton-esque horror comedy adventure Medieval remains a beloved PlayStation classic, which saw a remake by the name of Resurrection for PSP in 2005. Sir Dan's debut adventure has been rebuilt from the ground up. There's a new visual style and a new camera system, and these two things go a long way to, rather unfortunately, pick away at the tone and atmosphere of the original game like a child fascinated with a scab. Grotesque imagery perhaps, but this is a game about zombies and skeletons after all. Regardless, fans of the original found themselves repeatedly asking, why couldn't you have left this alone? Stages that were previously dark and moody are well lit and generic, and the new camera system, plus dreadful hitboxes, makes navigating at times a nightmare. All that said, the game just won't shut up. Comedy was one of Medieval's strong points, but it knew less was more. Resurrection changes the story by introducing a nonsensical motor-mouth genie sidekick and gives every NPC their own joke book's worth of one-liners each, making it at times feel like there's minutes between bouts of gameplay. Considering that Resurrection was made without the co-creators on board, it's not surprising that this one wound up feeling like a pale imitation. Number 8. YAKUZA KIWAMI. Taking the series back to the 1980s, Yakuza 0 managed to be a sturdy prequel that kept the series' high points all trucking along nicely. Best of all, it broke into the West more than any other game in the series. With this market opening up a little, it made sense for Like a Dragon to take a look at its back catalogue. Yakuza KIWAMI is a remake of the first game in the series, which, considering it had been released 9 years prior and was followed by a slew of titles that progressively made improvements to the formula, was showing its age. Whilst it maintains the core plot points, KIWAMI expertly ties itself seamlessly into the preceding prequel and fleshes out the story of the game's villain, Nishikiyama, who previously felt undercooked. The district of Kamurocho also, of course, not just looks much prettier, but is now stuffed with the kinds of mini-games and alternate activities the series is known for. Naturally, the biggest component KIWAMI changes is the combat. The remake ditches the game's original system, implanting the most recent revision from Zero. As solid as Yakuza was in 2005, its gameplay got a little repetitive over time. By bringing Kiryu's multiple styles into the mix, as well as more heat actions, it became a totally fresh experience for long-term fans. Number 7. Shadowrun. Starting life as a classic tabletop game, the sci-fi adventure world of Shadowrun has had a few video game adaptations over the years, and most of them at least made sense. For example, the first was for Super Nintendo and was decently well received, using the role-playing genre in a way that made the game feel like a reasonable adaptation of the universe. How exactly Shadowrun became a shallow multiplayer FPS game remains to be one of the universe's most bewildering unanswered questions. Throwing away a carefully constructed cyberpunk dystopian world prime for customizable player player experience and emergent storytelling, and using the name value for an average at best Xbox 360 shooter crushed the hopes of long-suffering Shadowrun fans. If you're going to toss your hat into the ring of a genre that is heating up against massive games like Call of Duty, you have to be confident in your product, and Shadowrun couldn't compete. To make matters worse, the 2007 title had its planned campaign mode axed during development. It shipped as a full-price multiplayer-only experience, adding to the general bad vibes of the entire release. The saving grace is that hitting rock bottom allowed the IP to eventually revive as an RPG again in 2013, with a title designed to reassure fans: Shadowrun returns. All's well that ends well. Number 6. Super Mario 64 DS. One of perhaps the most classic video game urban legends that turned out to be true was that Yoshi was hiding away in Super Mario 64. If you were good enough to grab every last Power Star in the game, you could reach the top of Princess Peach's castle and reunite with your dinosaur friend, merely just for the warm and fuzzy feelings. In the Nintendo DS remake of the classic 3D platformer, Yoshi isn't on the castle roof because you start by playing as him. Nintendo could have quite simply ported the genre-defining classic to the system as it was and probably sold a boatload of copies. Instead, they chose carefully what to keep and what to change, and surprisingly, the game's leading protagonist was one of the latter. Now, of course, Mario is very quickly unlocked, but he's also joined by Luigi and Wario, and all 4 characters are viable choices for all of the game's levels. They all share the stage equally, providing slightly different platforming approaches and allowing players, if they so wish, to turn the entire adventure into Super Wario 64. And who wouldn't want to do that? Package in 30 new Power Stars to find, a few mini-games, and some new abilities, and you've got a fun refresh of a classic that often gets overlooked. Number 5. Resident Evil 3. The award-winning 2019 reimagining of Resident Evil 2 dramatically shifted the gameplay style of the PS1 original from fixed camera angles to over-the-shoulder. Despite major changes, it still felt like RE2 because of the location of the ravaged Raccoon City Police Department. The game's follow-up, itself a reimagining of Resident Evil 3, struggled to run that same line. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was perhaps not the most memorable of the original trilogy, but the presence of the player-stalking Nemesis gave it a unique tone instead of a fixed point of interest. There was no puzzle box-style mansion or police station. Instead, players were forced to sprint through Raccoon City chased by this leather-bound monstrosity. As such, Capcom felt that they could remove or dramatically remix locations for the remake. The issue was, they sort of forgot to put the Nemesis in. Even as one of the staunchest defenders of Resident Evil 3's enjoyable fast-paced gameplay and right to do something different, I'll admit that the overall lack of Nemesis appearances crippled it. Instead of keeping players guessing where in the city he might show, Nemesis was merely fixed to one location. As such, RE3 felt like it was missing the key element from the game it was adapting. The results felt far more like a sequel to Resident Evil 2's remake rather than a remake in its own right. Number 4. Oddworld New and Tasty. Oddworld New and Tasty is a prime example of a remake that looks simple from the outside and yet shows that one alteration to a game's formula can have ripples throughout the whole title. In the original Abe's Odyssey, the world was a series of connected screens, which, if nothing else, was a sign of the limitations of the hardware. Notoriously hard, players could take solace in their ability to duck out and go back into rooms to reset puzzles back to their original state to try again. In New and Tasty, transitioning from one screen to another is replaced by a seamlessly scrolling camera. Naturally, this has a huge impact on how each puzzle is approached. Previous methods for solving puzzles are now non-viable. Enemies chasing Abe from one end of a corridor to the next is much more dramatic, and the game demands more careful consideration everywhere the player goes. The weighty controls from the original, whether it was jumping, running or rolling, have been swapped out for something more instantaneous. From a surface level, New and Tasty seems like just an HD remaster, and on the lead up to release, many fans wrongly assumed it was, but the change to perspective and controls turns the title into a game that plays completely different from its forebear. Number 3. Pokémon Let's Go, Pikachu and EEVEE. Nostalgia has its hooks in every long-serving franchise, but Pokémon in particular has acted on it a good number of times. Most recently, players were invited back to the region of Kanto in Let's Go Pikachu and EEVEE in 2018. Of course, it's a far cry from the Game Boy in visuals, but the gameplay also departs from even the most recent entries, as Let's Go attempts to align the original journey with certain sensibilities of the Pokémon Go augmented reality sensation. Players use motion controls to fling Pokeballs and can even team up with a friend. Clearly aimed at younger players, long time-serving Pokemon masters suffered with the title's insultingly low difficulty. Wild encounters with Pokemon no longer result in battles and are instead the ghost-styled spamming of Pokeballs. Players need not access their PC to switch Pokemon, they can do it at any time, meaning that wounded teams can be retired for fresh ones in the middle of a dungeon. It takes that memory of going off into the unknown, having an adventure, and overcoming obstacles with your animal friends and turns it into a power fantasy. The cooperative play is the worst offender, as every trainer battle becomes a 2-on-1 beatdown devoid of any consideration for balancing. If you thought Pokemon was animal cruelty before, that's nothing compared to high-powered Pikachu and EEVEE teaming up on every poor bug catcher in Viridian Forest. Number 2. Silent Hill Shattered Memories. With the remake of Silent Hill 2 on the way looking so far quite faithful to the original, many asked why Konami didn't reboot the long-dormant franchise with a remake of the first game instead. As it stands, the original Silent Hill was revisited in 2009 with Shattered Memories. Rather than merely update the game for the Wii, Shattered Memories takes advantage of the chance for a fresh playstyle. As Harry Mason explores Silent Hill for his missing daughter Cheryl, he encounters an icy outworld where he's hunted by monsters in high-energy chases. The game does away with combat entirely to emphasize panic and puzzle solving, and interspersed throughout are psychological evaluations that affect Harry's journey and the people he meets. The further into the story players go, the broader the changes are, with the final act, regardless of which ending you get, concluding with a vastly different outcome compared to the original. As it stands, Shattered Memories is a big enough departure from the source material in both storyline and gameplay that it exists in a sort of what-if universe. Whilst reactions from fans were mixed at the time, Shattered Memories reviewed well. Time has been kind too, since with the decade without an entry in the franchise, players have been less critical of its divergent narrative. Number 1. Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. Despite being largely associated with the PlayStation brand, Metal Gear Solid did have a brief dalliance with Nintendo when it brought enhanced editions of the first two games to the GameCube. The Twin Snakes, a 2004 remake of the original MGS, was redesigned in a way to bring it closer to the sequel. This meant a new visual style, as well as retrofitting the game with features like first-person aiming and being able to drag and hide bodies. Additionally, there's new music and entirely re-recorded voiceovers. However, most divisive are the cutscene alterations. Snake is almost constantly backflipping, often in slow motion in Twin Snake's FMVs. Let's not forget the moment where he jumps off a missile in a move that wouldn't be outside of the current state of the Fast and Furious franchise. Special guest director Ryuhei Kitamura seemed intent on aping the success of the Matrix trilogy, and these massive stylistic changes split opinion firmly down the middle. While some fans find them fun and goofy in a positive way, others thought it hurt the tone of a game that, whilst totally bonkers in its own right, managed to ground itself when necessary. It's all a matter of taste, but at the very least, the Twin Snakes presents an interesting retelling of a gaming classic. And that's the list. Let us know what you thought of this video down in the comments below, and which of these wildly changing remakes did you prefer over the original? Make sure you like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe and hit that notification bell. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.